Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's Sunday school lesson. As you probably saw in the notes, we're going to be talking about a story that's, not only near and dear to my heart, but I really, this week in preparing for this lesson, I really thought hard about what it what it means to be a woman, really, and a mother, and specifically, those women and mothers who make every effort to ensure that their children are taught well, that their husbands are supported, that those around them, feel of their love and encouragement and devotion. And so it's interesting to kind of think about that. And so we're going to take a brief tangent towards the end of this lesson because I want to address some words from our prophet back in 2015, as well as a concept in Genesis that we actually talked about at the beginning of the year. I don't think I put it on video, though, because I believe at that time we were still doing lessons actually at church. So I'm going to assume that at least for those of you watching today, maybe you're not familiar with some of those things. So we're going to talk about that. For some of you, it might be familiar already. You might be aware of it already. But we're gonna kind of address that as we go. So just kind of keep that in mind today. Again, we are still in the war chapters of the Book of Mormon, and so part of what we're going to share today is going to be historical in nature, basically describing what's going on. But one of the biggest things as well is that these wars, like I said, this produces some strong people that really show their faith in God, and show their faith in spite of what was happening around them, which I think is a really good example of how we should be, right? In spite of all the wars and things like that. So we're going to jump right into this. We are in Alma chapter 53. Hold on, my puppy wants to leave the room. Go on. She wanted to join me, and then she decided it wasn't opportune to join me. So chapter 53, again, some of these chapters we're going to skim through pretty quickly. I'm just going to describe what's going on. You can obviously read them on your own. Chapter 53 is one of those chapters. There's a few verses that I want to point out, but for the most part, we're just going to talk about briefly what's happening. As you recall from last week, at this point, Amalickiah was killed. Teancum killed him. Ammoron, his brother, Amalickiah's brother, becomes the new king over the Lamanites, the new leader. And Moroni, Captain Moroni, has been wounded at this point. And then Jacob, who was a Zoramite who was kind of put in charge of everything, was also killed, and they were able to take back some of the cities. So that's kind of what's going on. They have a ton of POWs, or prisoners of war. And so with those POWs, Moroni, since he's injured, I assume, at this point, he says, okay, let's go ahead and let's start fortifying our lands. And let's use the prisoners to do that, because it's a lot easier to manage the prisoners when they're helping us, build up our timbers and our forts and things like that, than just simply leaving them in a prison. So he puts them to work. And the thing is, he also takes care of them. They're well fed. They're well taken care of. And you know that because of Moroni wanting to do these exchanges of prisoners. He wants to do this exchange because he needs more provisions for his own people, even though he's taking care of these POWs. So again, we're just going to point out a few verses. First of all, verse 2, I just thought this was a really good example of the power of friendship. Moroni went to the city of Mulek with Lehi and took command of the city, gave it unto Lehi. Behold, this Lehi was a man who had been with Moroni in the more part of all his battles, and he was a man like unto Moroni. We already know about Moroni from last week, right? So a man like unto him, and they rejoiced in each other's safety. Yea, they were beloved by each other, and also beloved by all the people of Nephi. So I just thought that was kind of a powerful verse about this concept of brotherhood, and this friendship that Moroni and Lehi had created, especially during this time of war. Now, like I said, he puts the Lamanites to work. And in verse 7, I think that's really interesting. It came to pass that he did no more attempt to battle with the Lamanites in that year. Obviously, he's injured. He probably can't do a whole lot of battle at this point. But he did employ his men in preparing for war and in making fortifications to guard against the Lamanites, and also delivering their women and their children from famine and affliction and providing food for their armies. So while this war is going on, what are the women doing? The women are going through famine. They've got a lot of affliction. I mean, many of them at this point have lost fathers, husbands, sons, and then at the same time they're gardening and they're providing food for the armies. Okay, I think that's such a significant verse because it is a good example of what the women were doing at this time and the strength that they must have had to be able to go through what they went through, to the point that when Moroni gets injured, he takes a break and purposely positions his armies to go and deliver the women, or in other words, relieve them of what was happening, relieve them of having to provide food, relieve them from some of the affliction and the famine that had been happening among the women and the children. And so I thought that was pretty significant. The last thing that I want to point out in these verses, well, there's two more things. So in verse 3 and verse 4, we talk about this new city, or not a new city, it's kind of been mentioned before, but it's the city of Bountiful, okay? And he's using the POWs to really build up this city Bountiful. And at this point, the city of Bountiful becomes a very powerful city. The way they dig about all the timbers and create the wall around the whole city, it becomes one of the main points, if you will, of their history. Now, the reason this is significant is because based on the timeline, 100 years from now, when the Savior comes, where is he going to go? He's going to go to the city Bountiful. So I thought that was kind of a cool, just to point it out, that this city that had been in ruins from warfare, that this ends up being the center basically of where they store all the POWs, and he builds up this city to be one of the strongest thresholds within the country at that point. And obviously there's a temple there. We know that from obviously the Savior's visitation. So 100 years from now, we're going to talk about that, or at least 100 years in the timeline of what we're reading. But I just thought that was kind of interesting. This city Bountiful, where there was so much warfare and bloodshed, now in 100 years from now is going to become this central location for the delivery of the Savior's word. So I thought that was kind of cool. So the last thing in this chapter I want to talk about is in verses 13 and 14. So at this point, Moroni comes back and they're trying to relieve everyone. And you remember that group of Ammonites, the ones who made the oath that they wouldn't go to war? Well, their heart is really moved quite a bit. Why? Because they're seeing the aftermath of everything that's happening, and these people, the Nephites, who are giving up their lives to protect them, even though they had made this oath that they would never go to battle again, it started affecting them a little bit. Verse 13, it came to pass that when they saw the danger and the many afflictions and tribulations which the Nephites bore for them, they were moved with compassion, and they were desirous to take up arms in the defense of their country. I mean, who wouldn't? Right? But behold, as they were about to take their weapons of war, they were overpowered by the persuasions of Helaman and his brethren, assuming the missionaries, right? Because we know Helaman is the chief, he's a prophet, basically, at this point. He's taken over all the records, son of Alma, and he is doing all the religious activity among the people. So he persuades them not to break the oath. Because he feared, like it says, he feared lest that by doing so they should lose their souls. Therefore, all those who entered into this covenant were compelled to behold their brethren wade through their afflictions and their dangerous circumstances at this time. I mean, how hard would that be to be this people? You've made an oath and a commitment, but then you see the warfare and bloodshed around you. It would be pretty easy just to give up the covenant, right? To give it up. Now, I wanted to think about that for a moment. How many times are there things that we personally we know our weakness. We know things that can bring us down. And so we personally make an oath to give them up. But then when we see others struggling and going through what they might be going through because of that oath that we've made, it almost seems easy to want to break it. And so I just think this is a great example of holding true to the oath and covenant that you've made. And the reason this is so significant is because the people of Ammon, these Ammonites, had become so close to the Lord that their children, who were now growing up in this warfare, had been taught really well and had received the gospel, right? Their parents had really made every effort to teach and train them. And so they had a lot of sons. Now the sons, their kids, basically had never entered into this covenant. And so these kids decide, hey, we'll do it. We'll go out to war. Why not? We haven't made this covenant, and we want to protect our own families as well. And so because of this, they decide to join the warfare. Okay. Now, specifically when they join the warfare, and we're going to read this in verse 18 and 19. And behold, there were 2,000 of them, of these young men, who entered in this covenant and took their weapons of war to defend their country. Okay, so there's 2,000 of them, young men, that we learn here. And then the second piece is, now behold, as they had never hitherto been a disadvantage to the Nephites, they became now at this period of time a great support. And they took their weapons of war, and they would that Helaman should be their leader. Now, I want you to think about this for just a moment. This is something that kind of stood out to me as I was reading these verses. Helaman was a prophetic leader, right? His role was on the spiritual side of things, but now he is being asked to enter this war. And so the question is, how much did he really know about warfare? Especially since the majority of his days, he's been this missionary, right? And teaching the people under his father, Alma. So I think this is interesting because not only do they enter warfare, these kids, right, that don't even know warfare, but they don't, their leader, even Helaman, probably doesn't know warfare that well. So I think that's kind of interesting. The very leader that they put in charge is this spiritual giant, but may not be as versed in warfare as somebody else might be. So just kind of an interesting thought about that chapter. Obviously, a description of these folks. They were all young men. They were exceedingly valiant for courage and also for strength and activity. Behold, this was not all. They were men who were true at all times in whatsoever thing they were entrusted. Yea, they were men of truth and soberness, for they had been taught to keep the commandments of God and to walk uprightly before him. So there are some attributes of these stripling warriors. Now, who taught them those things? Their mothers, right? We're going to read a little bit about that. But that's where they learned this. And so it's kind of exciting. I mean, this group came in and now they're kind of giving some spirit, if you will, back to the warfare because they had lost so much. And, like I said, Moroni is injured at this point. And so it kind of buoys people up and gets them a little excited again about this concept of, hey, we're doing this for the right reason. Even though we've lost a lot of people, we're in it for the right reason. So chapter 54, Amram and Moroni have kind of this exchange. Okay, now at this point, just from a timeline perspective, the war has been going on for about 10 years, thereabouts. Okay, so it's been going on for a while. I mean, there's several years of warfare here, and I think the core of it's been going on for about 6 years, where they've really lost a lot of people. So Amram sends a messenger, says, "Hey, we want to go ahead and finish this thing out. Let's trade prisoners and let's abandon this whole war thing." And Amram writes this epistle for the exchange, and Moroni sees right through it. He's like, "Come on, I get it." And so he writes a letter back. Now, this is kind of an interesting concept of communication, because in the letter, Moroni basically says that murderers and people like you are going to go to hell, basically. And then in another verse, he actually calls him, "Thou art a child of hell," in verse 11. I don't know if that's the best way to communicate when you're trying to exchange prisoners. we learn in chapter 55 why that is. We kind of get it. But it's just kind of interesting. And Moroni basically says, look, I'll give you one prisoner for a family, man, woman, and their children. Okay. So if you want to do this exchange, that'll be my terms. One man for my family, right? Like our families that we're trying to get back. So he's doing everything in his power to try to get people back. And he makes these comments about Amram, which is kind of interesting. We don't know all the context, so we obviously can't judge. But in chapter 55, because like I said, we're not going to go through a lot of this. But actually, verse 23, one interesting thing about Amram. I am Amram and a descendant of Zoram, whom your fathers pressed and brought out of Jerusalem. So if we go back to the very beginning of the Book of Mormon, remember Zoram, the servant of Laban, who was pressed by Nephi to say, hey, why don't you just come with us instead of going back and tattling, if you will? Just come with us, you'll be free. And so Amram is now taking that experience 600 years before, 550 years before, and is using that as an excuse for his warfare, if you will. And there are other things that he puts in the murder of his brother from Teancum. Like he uses some of these things that says, you've murdered too, so wouldn't you go to hell as well? Like, come on, it's a give and take here. And it's just an interesting take because if you think about it, Amram is kind of right in that sense. Like logically, he's trying to put that together, but spiritually, he's completely missed the mark. And sometimes that happens when people are in that wicked state, right? They're only seeing what they want to see. They're not perceiving through the spirit some of the things that are happening. And it was true. Moroni had killed people, and Teancum obviously murdered the brother, but it was due to this warfare of them coming against them. As we talked about last week, the Lord justifies them defending and protecting themselves. So just kind of an interesting concept. This is why I'm glad the Lord is judge, right? The Lord ultimately can decide who goes where and how that works. It's going to judge us by our hearts and our desires. So chapter 55. So this is where you learn a little bit about what Moroni already knows about Amram. So I want to read it. It came to pass when Moroni had received this epistle, he was more angry because he knew Amram had a perfect knowledge of his fraud. So in spite of what was said, we see that Moroni and Amram probably go back a little bit. They know each other to a point. And he knows Amram has a perfect knowledge of what's going on. I mean, think about what he and Amalickiah did to thwart the entire kingdom of the Lamanites in last week's lesson. So he knew what was going on. Yeah, he knew that Amram knew that it was not a just cause that had caused him to wage a war against the people of Nephi. Okay? So maybe that justifies a little bit some of the things that Moroni says in the previous chapter. But basically, they withdrew their purpose. Moroni's, look, I'm not going to exchange it. In fact, Moroni realizes, he says, you know what? I wanted to give him a chance to exchange prisoners. But now that I think about it, we have enough power that we could go in and take the prisoners back. So let's just do that. So what does he do? He goes among his people, and he finds a man named Laman, who is actually one of the servants of the king that Amalickiah had tricked and poisoned to kill him, all that stuff, and slew him. Not Lahontai poisoned, but the actual king of the Lamanites that Amalickiah had tricked into giving up the entire kingdom, and they killed him, right? So this is one of those servants who had fled, right? So they find him, and they get a group of other people that look like Lamanites, and they send them over to this Lamanite threshold where the people are, where the prisoners are, basically, the Nephite prisoners, and they get them drunk. So they have this wine. I love how it talks about it in here. He says, hey, we have this wine. We escaped from the Nephites. Let's not drink it now, though. I mean, of course, if you're going to say that, what are they going to want to do? The Lamanites are, no, forget it. Let's drink it now. Let's enjoy this. So it had been prepared, especially for them, right? And so they all got drunk really badly. They all fall asleep. And so what does Moroni do? Moroni, Laman goes back and says, hey, this just happened. So, because he's probably just without the walls, right? Just outside. So he tells Moroni, and then they slip in some weapons of war over the wall to all the prisoners at that point, all the Nephite prisoners. So that when the Lamanites wake up in the morning, they're surrounded. They're surrounded. And so the good news is this whole stratagem actually avoids bloodshed. So instead of going to war and having bloodshed, Moroni does this thing, which is really tricky, but at the end of the day, he avoids bloodshed, right? He avoids hurting anyone because, again, when you look at Moroni's desire and what he wanted to accomplish, he was just simply trying to defend his people. and in this case, save the prisoners of war, which included a lot of families. And it's interesting because it even talks in here how all of the prisoners that Moroni had were just men. Okay, but yet the prisoners that the Lamanites had included women and children too. So the Lamanites were, no holds barred. It wasn't just about taking, the city and taking the men. It's about taking everyone. Okay, and so that was, that must have been really hard, just taking everyone. Can you imagine what those children must have gone through, and some of those women and things like that? I couldn't even imagine. But such is warfare among the Nephites and the Lamanites. And so he's able to kind of take them. He follows through with his word, as it said in verse 3, I'm going to follow through with my word. So that's what they do. They go ahead and they take all the prisoners back. They obviously get more prisoners from the Lamanites with the city they just took. And then they, make them, fix everything and make everything, more secure, and then send them off to Bountiful. Okay, where the prisoners are all being kept at this point, to kind of take advantage of the situation. So that's kind of what happens. And it's funny because towards the end of this chapter, the Lamanites try to start doing some of the same things. And not only do they try to do the same things where they're sending these tributes of wine or whatever, but they're also poisoning some of them. And so the Lamanites are thinking, wow, that was a cool idea. I'm going to try it on the Nephites, and it doesn't work. The Nephites see right through it, but such is what happens. So there's your chapter 55. More historical, like I said, not a lot of doctrinal stuff in there. But now we get to chapters 56, 57, and 58. And the lesson today actually goes to chapter 63, but I'm actually going to stop at chapter 58 this week. Maybe I'll record a video about the other chapters for later on. It's a letter between Moroni and Pahoran, the chief judge at the time. And so maybe I'll do a lesson this week and just throw it on there if you guys want to watch it. But we're going to stop at chapter 58 today, okay? Just because of a lot of what's happening, and like I said, a little bit of what I want to cover at the end. So basically, the communication between Moroni and Helaman are via letters, because Moroni is in one part of the camp, if you will, one part of the warfare in the land, and Helaman is basically on the other side, okay? And at this point, at the state of war in his area, where Helaman is at, and like I said, Helaman was this spiritual leader, and so for him to take over and actually go to war was probably very hard for him and significant in a way, if you really think about it. So he kind of takes over and starts writing a letter to Moroni about what's happening. So at this stage, there are 4 specific cities that have been taken, okay? And so Helaman kind of starts the letter that says, hey, here's some of these cities. I just took over these 2,000 stripling warriors. He calls them his sons, just because of the relationship he has with them. I imagine Helaman was teaching among them quite a bit. I can only imagine he visited them often, especially with the kind of strength and faith that they had, that people had. I'm sure Helaman was there a lot. And so he takes over these 2,000 men, and they decide to march to the city of Judea. So they're going to start trying to take over these 4 cities that had been lost. Now, the leader at that time in that area was Antipas. So Antipas is the one that basically has lost these cities. And Antipas is really downtrodden at this point. If you can imagine, you lose 4 cities, you're being attacked from all sides, and there was a lot of blood that was shed, right? The 4 cities you learn about are in verse 14, Manti, Zeezrom, Cumeni, and Antipara. And Antipas is just depressed. Look at verse 16. They were depressed in body as well as in spirit, for they had fought valiantly by day and toiled by night to maintain their cities, and thus they had suffered great afflictions of every kind. So really hard. And Helaman talks about at the beginning of this epistle the vast numbers of people that were slain, and he says, yes, we have cause to mourn, but verse 11, nevertheless, we may console ourselves in this point, that they have died in the cause of their country and their God, yea, and they are happy. Now, that's sometimes hard to say. When you're in the middle of a bad situation, and especially when you actually lose people's lives, the last thing sometimes we think about is that they're happy, right? But at the same time, their faith was such that the Spirit probably provided an element of comfort here, so that when it did happen, they realized that they gave their lives for the cause. They gave their lives for the right reason, and the Lord's going to bless them for that. And so, therefore, there's this element of happiness there. So, just kind of an interesting thought there. Like I said, when you're going through it, it doesn't always seem that way. But ultimately, the hope is that the Spirit can touch our hearts enough that we realize that, yeah, they gave their lives for the right reason. And so there is an element of happiness there, especially with the faith and hope that we're going to see them again, right? So he comes, Helaman comes with these people to Antipas's help. And they're excited. It gives them hope again. They had been in this depressed state. And he decides that, hey, we're going to go ahead and go and help. And it's interesting because in verse 19, and thus they were favored of the Lord, for they talking about the Lamanites attacking. So the Lamanites decided to withdraw. They saw these 2,000 stripling warriors arrive, and so the Lamanites gave up. And the first thing Helaman thinks about is that we were favored of the Lord, for had they come upon us in this our weakness, they might have perhaps destroyed our little army, but thus we were preserved. So he's already recognizing this first being preserved. I don't know, perseverance. And so it was just kind of interesting that the first thing that Helaman is starting to recognize is the hand of the Lord in these events. Because had the Lamanites not abandoned their purpose and had come against them, he fears they would have been killed. Because they certainly weren't ready. I mean, these sons, right, had never really fought before. And Helaman, for all we know, didn't do a whole lot of fighting either, right? And so he recognizes right away this blessing from the Lord that the Lamanites, upon their arrival, they decide to kind of abandon their purpose. And so there's spies around. They know which cities are needing to be defended. They try several ways to get the Lamanites to come out and things like that. Nothing really works. And so, in the meantime, they're just kind of getting people coming. They've got people arriving. So as this is all happening and they're trying to decide how do we, take over the city, and an event occurs where they are able to kind of lead some of the army out. And it's Helaman and his stripling sons that are basically leading the Lamanites out, right? Well, as this is happening, he knows Antipas and his army is ahead of them. And for some reason, the Lamanites stopped chasing him. And so he's like, you know what? Maybe they've started attacking Antipas. We probably should turn back around. So he asks these sons, he asks the stripling warriors that are with him and says, hey, guys, what do you think we should do? Now, and verse 43, and now whether they were overtaken by Antipas, we knew not. But I said unto my men, behold, we know not, but they have halted for the purpose that we should come against them, that they might catch us in their snare. So here's the dilemma. Maybe Antipas has caught up with them, but maybe they're just trying to trick us. We don't know at this point. So what do you say? So he asked them, therefore, what say ye, my sons? Will ye go against them to battle? You guys have never fought before. You don't know warfare. You've never had arms before. Your parents hadn't had arms for years. So obviously there was not a whole lot of training that had happened. But yet, here's the question. Do we go to war? And they say yes. And he says, Moroni, never had I seen so great courage, nay, not amongst all the Nephites. For as I had ever called them my sons, even so they said unto me, Father, behold, our God is with us, and he will not suffer that we should fall. Then let us go forth. We would not slay our brethren if they would let us alone. Therefore, let us go, lest they should overpower the army of Antipas. So the assumption is Antipas must be being attacked. So let's go. And they recognized the Lord being with them. Now they had never fought, yet they did not fear death. And they did think more upon the liberty of their fathers than they did upon their lives. Yea, they had been taught by their mothers that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them. So I can only imagine that the mothers are the ones that sat down with these young men before they left and promised them that if you don't doubt, God will deliver you and God will protect you. And by golly, those young men believed it. They believed what their mothers had told them. And I think it's so significant, and they rehearsed unto me the words of their mothers, saying, we do not doubt. Our mothers knew it. So their faith is so strong in the Lord because of their faith and strength in their own mothers. Their mothers, I mean, I would imagine for a lot of these young men, this was the first time ever in their lives where that faith was actually tested. Okay. But they had received such a witness and a testimony because of their mothers and from their mothers that they didn't fear. They knew the Lord would protect them. They just knew. So at the same time, there is no doubt these young men had lived a life such that each one of them had their own testimony and witness of who God was, who they were as a child of God, and what that actually meant. And so I think those are some significant things to think about. The mothers can teach all they want, but the children still have to receive, right? And so both things are coming into play here, and the faith is astounding. So they go to battle, and sure enough, and we're going to basically read this in the last little bits of the verses here. Verse 56. So the battle happens. Helaman's a little worried. You know, everything's over. They win. Basically, they capture the Lamanites. And Helaman's scared a little bit. He's like, I wonder how many we lost. That was a pretty tough battle. And so he goes, but behold, to my great joy, I'm in verse 56, there had not one soul of them fallen to the earth. Yea, and they had fought as if with the strength of God. Yea, never were men known to have fought with such miraculous strength. And with such mighty power did they fall upon the Lamanites that they did frighten them. And for this cause did the Lamanites deliver themselves up as prisoners of war. So they went in with that power of God and were able to conquer. And as we had no place for our prisoners, we decided to send them to Zarahemla. So they kind of talk about. But the miracle here in this first battle ever, for both Helaman and the stripling warriors, nobody was hurt. Or nobody was slain. I'm sure there were some people that were hurt, but nobody was killed. So 2,000 of them, and none of them are killed. Miraculous. But then it becomes even more miraculous. Helaman is in shock by this first event, but they've still got 3 other cities to take care of here. They've still got a few cities that they need to work on. And Ammoron actually sends Helaman an epistle at this point and tries to do an exchange of prisoners, but nothing works out, as is the case with Ammoron, it seems. And so they decide, we're just going to go to battle. So we get to chapter 57. I'll flip over my notes here. So during this time, as they're getting ready for the next battle, 60 more of the Ammonites come. So now his sons are 2,060. They come, and then there's also 6,000 more people that come in this group. So their army literally just increased tremendously. So talk about, this strength, if you will, and vigor. They're ready to fight. And so they do. They go and they start cutting off the supplies of the Lamanites to take over some of the cities. They surround everything by night and things like that. And so they kind of cut off all the supplies so that a lot of the Lamanites just simply give up. And it's good because in a way you avoid some of the battles, but unfortunately some of the Lamanites, as when they're taken prisoners, they still go crazy and they break out in different numbers. It says in verse 14, they would break out in great numbers and they would fight with stones and clubs and whatever else they could find, in so much that we had to kill a lot of them, unfortunately. And so a few things that happen, but for the most part, they're able to kind of take over some of these cities. And then there's another city that they need to take over. And again, I want to read some of the verses here where we talk specifically about, we've talked about some of the elements of their belief and their faith. But not only do they believe it, but they also exercise it. So look at verse 21, okay? They were firm and undaunted in verse 20, and yea, they did obey and observe to perform every word of command with exactness. Yea, and even according to their faith, it was done unto them. And I did remember the words which they said unto me, that their mothers had taught them. And now behold, it was these my sons and those men who had been selected to convey the prisoners, to whom we owe this great victory. For it was they who did beat the Lamanites, therefore they were driven back to the city of Manti. And so they're able to, retain Cumeni. And so it's just kind of interesting that he just reckoned, Not only were they faithful, but they were exact in their obedience. Exact. They performed every word with exactness in this battle. And again, I recognize that sometimes these physical things that we do, while not spiritual in a sense, but yet our obedience and observing with exactness those things lead to the spiritual deliverance, right? We've kind of talked about that before. So their preservation was just astonishing, as it says to the whole army in verse 26. Because what they do, after this battle, they came to pass, in verse 25, 200 out of my 2,060 had fainted because of the loss of blood. So they go through to look at everyone, and they find 200 of them, they're all fainted. For all they knew, they were dead, right? But they, nevertheless, according to the goodness of God and to our great astonishment and also the joy of our whole army, there was not one soul of them who did perish. Yea, and neither was there one soul among them who had not received many wounds. So every single one of them at this point have wounds, right? They've been wounded, okay? So they've suffered casualty in that sense, but none of them have passed away, even after 200 of them had fainted on the battlefield. Now their preservation was astonishing to our whole army, yea, that they should be spared while there was 1,000 of our brethren who were slain. So they lost 1,000 men in this entire battle, but yet none of the stripling warriors, none of the Ammonites had been killed. And we do justly ascribe it to the miraculous power of God because of their exceeding faith in that which they had been taught to believe, that there was a just God, and whosoever did not doubt that they should be preserved by his marvelous power. Now this was the faith of whom I have spoken. They are young, and their minds are firm, and they do put their trust in God continually. Okay? I mean, just amazing to read about this battle, but yet the faith of these young men who are doing everything in their power to preserve and protect, and for Helaman to recognize the Lord's hand in all of this. Sometimes when we're going through these physical experiences and battles, if you will, in our lives and struggles, it can be hard to see the Lord in it, right? It can be very hard to recognize that the Lord can have a hand and does have a hand in our lives. And so I just think it's amazing that not only does Helaman recognize it and the stripling warriors recognize it, but also the army, the rest of the group starts to recognize it. That there's something about these kids that is really making a difference. The Lord truly is with us. And I imagine it was a boost of faith for everyone involved. And so just a beautiful story about these young men and their efforts to take back these cities, okay? So they have success. They get some of these cities, and now we get to the last chapter of today's lesson about chapter 58 and their desires to take over this city called Manti. So first and foremost, at this point, Helaman's epistle kind of turns not sour, but he's a little concerned because they've been asking the government, if you will, to send them more supplies and more provisions and more men, right, from an army perspective. But they're not getting anything. They're not getting any response. And in fact, not only are they not getting a response, but something does arrive, but it's almost like it's not even enough to provide for the people that arrived. It was almost like they laughed at him and said, we're going to perish for want of food. It came to pass we did wait in these difficult circumstances, I'm in verse 7, for the space of many months, even until we were about to perish for the want of food. But it came to pass that we did receive food, which was guarded to us by an army of 2,000 men. So they received 2,000 men in the food. And this is all the assistance which we did receive, to defend ourselves and our country from falling into the hands of our enemies, yea, to contend with an enemy which was innumerable. And now the cause of these are embarrassment. So Helaman sees this as an embarrassment. Or the cause why they did not send more strength unto us, we know not. Therefore we were grieved and also filled with fear, lest by any means the judgments of God should come upon our land to our overthrow and utter destruction. So suddenly he realizes that this is almost, this is good. We got some support, but it's almost laughable. And there's huge concern here. In fact, Helaman is fearing that maybe there's an insurrection happening, and now we are going to get destroyed, in spite of all of our faith and everything that we've done. And so Helaman does what he knows to do in verse 10. Therefore, we did pour out our souls in prayer to God, that he would strengthen us and deliver us out of the hands of our enemies, yea, and also give us strength that we might retain our cities and our lands and our possessions for the support of our people. So Helaman may not have been versed in, warfare, but he was versed in knowing what it meant to reach out to that supreme being, our Heavenly Father. And so he pours out his soul in prayer and has everybody in the camp do it, I'm sure. And they pour out their souls under prayer. And then verse 11 is the answer, which I think is beautiful. Yea, it came to pass, they took the action, they said the prayer, it came to pass that the Lord our God did visit us with assurances that he would deliver us. So the Spirit came into the camp and gave him comfort. I mean, what a beautiful thing. Yea, insomuch that he did speak peace to our souls and did grant unto us great faith, because they were losing faith. They were starting to get afraid. Okay, did grant to us great faith and to cause us that we should hope for our deliverance in him. So I just love this. We did take courage with our small force, which we had received. We were fixed with determination to conquer our enemies and to maintain our lands and our possessions and our wives and our children and the cause of our liberty. And in this state, we went forth against the Lamanites. So I just think it's a beautiful thing. And Manti was the biggest stronghold that the Lamanites had in that area. And previously they hadn't really gone up because they were afraid they were going to lose. And so finally they decided, let's just do it. Let's go up there. We may not be as strong in our numbers, but we have faith. And the Lord has granted us this peace. He's visited us with his Spirit. And so let's do it. So they go. They go up to battle against them. And basically to kind of explain what they do here, not only do they find courage, but they start hiding some of their armies around, and then Helaman takes his group to go up to battle, and then they kind of flee again, similar to what they had done before. And what happens is they flee as the Lamanites literally send the whole army, which is not very smart on the Lamanites' part, but they probably saw the small group, and they're like, oh man, that's a small group. We can take them. Let's just go take care of it. So they send the whole army, so let's just tear them down. While Tiamner and all of them are hiding in the bushes, they pass them, and so they kill off the spies and they go take over the city really easily. And then from there, they basically scare the Lamanites, and so the Lamanites decide, let's turn back around and go back, but it's already nighttime. So the Lamanites go to sleep, and then Helaman takes his men, and I think this is like verse 26 or something like that. Yeah, while they were asleep, they marched towards Manti to take over. So in the nighttime, they kind of leave and let the Lamanites sleep, but then they just keep moving all night. So they were probably tired when they got there. Luckily, Tiamner and some of the other people are there. But they take over the city, basically. And so they take over this huge threshold without a single person being killed. Verse 28, thus it came to pass by this stratagem, we did take possession of the city of Manti without the shedding of blood. So significant. So not only was this prayer that they made, I think this is so important to recognize. Not only did they pray and receive strength to take over the strongest hold in the area, but that prayer also became a blessing to the enemies, because the enemies lost no one. They lost nobody. I just think that's so significant that sometimes the prayers of the faithful and the good and righteous people also lead to a positive outcome for the wicked. I think it's really, really neat to kind of see that. So at that point, they take over. They're so grateful for everything that has happened. They recognize the Lord in all this. In verse 33, we trust in our God who has given us victory over these lands. So they've now taken over all the cities again. We do not know the cause. The government does not grant us more strength. Neither do those men who came up unto us know why we've not received greater strength. So even the people that brought them provisions didn't know. Behold, we do not know, but what ye are unsuccessful, and maybe ye have drawn away the forces into that quarter of the land. So he's telling Moroni, maybe you needed more than us, and so they've gone to you. If so, we do not desire to murmur. And if it is not so, behold, we fear that there is some faction in the government that they do not send more men to our assistance, for we know that they are more numerous than that which they have sent. So we know there's more there than what they've sent. But behold, it mattereth not. We trust God will deliver us, notwithstanding the weakness of our armies, yea, and deliver us out of the hands of our enemies. Behold, this is the 29th year in the latter end, and we have the possessions of our lands again. And out of these sons of Helaman, none of them have been slain, right? They've received many wounds, but yet, nevertheless, in verse 40, they stand fast in that liberty wherewith God has made them free, and they are strict to remember the Lord their God from day to day. Yea, they do observe to keep his statutes and his judgments and his commandments continually, and their faith is strong in the prophecies concerning that which is to come. Beautiful, beautiful kind of end to those chapters that we're going to cover today. So, my last comments are words from a prophet. And it's interesting because this talk was given in 2015. And the reason I wanted to bring it up, and let me show something to you. And again, we've talked about this in lessons before, but I'm going to show this to you. So in the scriptures in Genesis, there is this kind of symbol. I'll just kind of show it to you. It might be backwards on the computer screen here. Resh Zayin Ayin, which means Azer. Okay, so this word means Azer, and the reason I bring this up is because of this, powerful impact that women can have, especially in this scenario where the mothers and the women in the lives of these men, as well as these young men, had such a powerful impact on these battles among the Nephites. So I just wanted to bring this up because in Genesis. Okay, you know how you have in Genesis, you have the introduction of Adam, and then Eve is brought later on, and the scriptures specifically talk how that she was set to be an helpmeet. Well, unfortunately, in our day, that concept or term of helpmeet is misinterpreted, and here's what I mean by that. So when God created Eve, he used this word Azer, which describes helpmeet. But it meant so much more than that, because in the Old Testament, the Lord only used the word Azer a few more times, and it was usually in the context of vitally important and powerful acts of rescue during battle. Okay, so introducing Eve to Adam at that point and using that word Azer like he has. In fact, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 10 through 12, if you want to reference this, okay? Samuel, they have this huge battle and miraculously were delivered, okay? And so they call the place Ebenezer, or in our term vernacular in English, Ebenezer, right? That's how we oftentimes say it, is Ebenezer, but it's actually Azer, okay, Ebenezer. And it represented strength, rescue, protector, help. So it's more than just help me. And like I said, in these battles in the Old Testament, the term Azer was used to represent the Lord in this power of deliverance. And I think it's such a beautiful thing to recognize that in Genesis, when Eve is created and introduced, she's not just simply an helpmeet like we see in our English language, but the word used was actually Azer. So she was a strength, a rescuer, a protector, a helper. That is so much more than just an helpmeet, okay? Because sometimes when you think of an helpmeet, at least in the English language, you think of like a servant or subservient or less than. That was not the case. When Eve was introduced, the Lord used the strongest word possible, Azer, and truly meant that Eve was to be a strength and a rescuer, okay? I think that's so significant to understand because, like I said, sometimes in the scriptures, because of that English version, we lose the concept of what that actually meant, okay? So I want you to think about that for just a moment. So here Eve is described as an Azer, one of the most powerful words that the Lord ever used. And like I said, the only other times that he used that word Azer in the Old Testament was to describe a battle that had occurred with the Israelites, as an example, where the Lord miraculously delivered them. And so if you think about that for just a moment, Eve, in being introduced to Adam as an Azer, was to be part of that miraculous deliverance, this strength and protector. That is the true definition of what Eve was when the Lord introduced her to Adam. Now that we understand that, because it's so important to know, I want to share this last comment from President Nelson. In October of 2015, a talk that he gave was called A Plea to My Sisters. And I'm going to kind of read it here. I have it on a different screen, but I want to read what he actually said. Again, thinking of what this means to be an Azer, okay? First of all, President Spencer W. Kimball made a prophecy, basically, in 1979. And this is what he said: much of the major growth that is coming to the church in the last days will come because many of the good women of the world, not just the church, many of the good women of the world will be drawn to the church in large numbers. This will happen to the degree that the women of the church reflect righteousness and articulateness in their lives, and to the degree that the women of the church are seen as distinct and different in happy ways from the women of the world. That was the prophecy, okay? And then later on, he goes on to quote President Packer, okay, who says, we need women with the gift of discernment who can view the trends in the world and detect those that, however popular, are shallow or dangerous, okay? And then finally, he adds his own comment to this, and this was the ultimate part that I wanted to share, but I wanted to kind of build up to that, right? Today, let me add that we need women who know how to make important things happen by their faith, and who are courageous defenders of morality and families in a sin-sick world. We need women who are devoted to shepherding God's children along the covenant path toward exaltation, women who know how to receive personal revelation and who understand the power and peace of the temple endowment, women who know how to call upon the powers of heaven to protect and strengthen children and families, women who teach fearlessly. So, there is no doubt in my mind in today's lesson that the women in that day, especially the mothers, taught fearlessly. They were women of strength. They called upon the powers of heaven so much so that their sons also called upon the powers of heaven when they were in the situations that they were in. Okay? There's no doubt in my mind, too, that it is true, this prophecy, that the women of this world are because you see it already, they are starting to recognize these sinful natures of men, if you will. And, you know, it's interesting, as I was thinking about this week, you know, in the scriptures, there's always this comment that in the last days, men's hearts shall fail them. There is no doubt in my mind that not only have men's hearts failed them, but they've failed their women, right? Men's hearts are failing their own women. And you've seen some very powerful people in this country and just people of power who have taken advantage of that. And their hearts have truly failed, okay? Their hearts have truly failed. And the powerful women who are standing up to that and fighting against that wickedness and doing everything in their power to make it known is such a powerful witness and testimony to me that what Elder Spencer W. Kimball said, that the much of the major growth is coming because the many good women of the world will be drawn to it. I have no doubt that that's happening. Even in my work environment, I work with a lot of women. I'm in HR, human resources. A lot of the people, our CEO really believes heavily in hiring women, especially women who've been battered down, women who are coming back to work for the first time in many years, which is fairly common here in Utah. And it amazes me how many of them are divorced, how many of them have had men whose hearts failed them, right? And as a result, they're living a single life, and they're having to go through some of the challenges that they go through, and yet their strength and commitment to teaching their children the right things. I think it's such a powerful witness and testimony to me that the strength and the power that they are showing is the very reason why women of the world are going to recognize and see that and be drawn to that. Why would they not be drawn to that? So my final witness and testimony today, is, as well as an invitation, is that us as men, that our hearts not fail us, but that our hearts, more importantly, don't fail the women in our lives. And at the same time, that we as men can stand up and support them, just as they've been an azer for us in our life. We can be an azer to them as well, because without them, we're nothing. Without them, there's no rescue. There's no miraculous rescue without them. And for the women of the world and the women listening, continue to be that azer and that proper title that God gave you at the very beginning. That was the title he gave Eve, and that was the title that he intended for every woman on this earth. And so continue to be that azer in a world of sin-sick world, as the prophet has said, that you can continue to be that strength and that rescue to all of those around us, to our children, and to the men that we work with and support. I love you. I'm so grateful for the opportunity I have to talk about these types of things. I know a lot of us are not going to church right now. I'm hoping these lessons have been beneficial, and please share it with somebody that you know that might need to hear it. I absolutely love you guys. I'm so grateful for the women in my life, from the women in my own home and the women that I've known at work, my own mother, my wife, my own daughters, who make every effort. My daughter Hannah the other day was sharing an experience about morality and how firm she was in that. And I just thought to myself, you're the reason. It's interesting, as I was preparing this lesson this week, just these little things that happen, and that conversation with my daughter yesterday just reminded me of how powerful women can be. And even more powerful when you put your trust and strength in the Lord, and you recognize that and you pray for it. And so that would have been my invitation, is to continue to do that, continue to ask for that strength, and be like the sons of Helaman who poured out their heart to God when they needed it, and recognized the women in their lives that made all the difference, the women who were azers to them. And so of that I bear witness, and do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Look, Dad, look at